this one. Welcome. Welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce is the wrong word because the Prime Minister hardly needs an introduction. The Prime Minister of Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and Daron Acemoglu, who, as I'm sure all of you know, is a very distinguished professor of economics, so distinguished that he is the 2024 Nobel Prize winner in economics. I think we should all congratulate you here this evening. Well done. And in particular, a great authority on poverty, distribution of wealth. Among his many best-selling books are How Nations Fail, and he is also one of the most cited economists in the world, so we're very fortunate to have him with us here this evening. But let's start off, Prime Minister, with you. We've been hearing a lot over the past 2 days about the state of the world, the state of Europe, the state of Greece. In a nutshell, state of world, terrible, state of Greece, really quite good. So please give us your thoughts on this tightrope that we see behind us of the world economy and the world itself in a rather perilous position at the moment.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I apologize because stylistically I cannot compete with both your socks, but I guess I have to be slightly more traditional in my dress code. Well, as far as the state of Greece is concerned, I don't want to talk, too much because I'm sure we'll be able to speak more about the performance of the Greek economy. I would just ask you to remember where we were 10 years ago to the day. This was the week before the sort of fateful referendum called by the then Syriza Anel government at a time when Greece was staring down the abyss with a real possibility of us exiting the Eurozone. And the end result of this experiment with this type of aggressive diplomacy was a third program, and unfortunately Greece, being a laggard in growth between 2015 and 2019, is further diverging from Europe. I mean 6 years later, our public finances are in order. Our borrowing cost is more or less at par with that of France. We're borrowing cheaper than Italy, certainly the UK, certainly the United States. We're producing primary surpluses. And we're able at the same time to drive a pro-growth policy that focuses a lot on investment, job creation, expanding labor market participation, while making sure that we also address the fundamental questions, long-term questions of how we have a competitive economy that can perform well in the long term. Of course, there are significant challenges ahead, important reforms that need to be completed. And as a big fan of your work, Professor, I was always struck by your book, Why Nations Fail, or Why They Succeed, and a big fan of the theory of inclusive growth, which means that at the end of the day, our purpose is to ensure that whatever growth we create, it needs to be equitably distributed. That is why the focus of my government has been on making sure that nominal wages increase, taxes decrease, and that we really focus on the disposable income of the lower income, but also the middle class. And this is, I think, at the end, the one agenda on which we will be judged. I'll say to the world, very quickly, this is a different world from what we knew even some years ago. A lot of the fundamental parameters of a world order that was created essentially after the Second World War, or certainly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, no longer seem to hold true. And it is a responsibility. We are responsible as European leaders to ensure that our continent and our united Europe, which is a very, very big market, but unfortunately not able to fully leverage it. Enrico may have a few things to say about how the single market is functioning or is not functioning. So in a world where a multipolar world where regional blocs are more and more important, I would say that our number one priority is to ensure that we drive those changes in Europe that will allow us to remain competitive and relevant at a time when the parameters of the world order have changed, not always in our favor. So I'll stop here because you don't want a long monologue on an open-ended topic, because if you give a politician a microphone with an open-ended question,
well, thank you for leaving a lot of time for conversation. That's appreciated. Before turning to Daron Acemoglu, can I just ask you one follow-up question, which is, I believe Angela Merkel is in town these days. She's written a book, and of course, for that 10-year period that you described, she was a big player. So I'm wondering what reflections you would have with Angela Merkel over that period and how it played out, and what you would tell her about how Greece has responded.
Well, I'm going to see her tomorrow, catch up, and it's interesting what she thinks in terms of the progress that was made. She was there during the very difficult, almost fateful negotiations. I think she contributed significantly to ensure that some of the more aggressive plans for a temporary exit of Greece from the Eurozone never materialized. And of course, we were together at the European Council when some very important decisions were taken during the pandemic. But she was also the one who finally agreed to the Recovery and Resilience Fund. I remember her saying no, 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 until she finally said yes, and thankfully so, because she understood that Europe needed to do something dramatic and very significant to address the post-COVID economic downturn. And this was a decision which could also serve as a blueprint for what needs to be done in the future. So, I hope she recognizes the progress that was made, and I may point out that on certain issues, on certain topics such as digitization and the way we use technology, which is again a topic I care a lot about and you have written a lot about, I would dare to say that Greece now is ahead of many, many European countries in terms of the digital state, and how we sort of break down bureaucratic silos, clientelistic sort of mentalities. At the end of the day, you need a well-functioning, impersonal public administration that doesn't do favors and that doesn't judge people depending on how they vote. And technology is, to a great extent, a solution to what was, and to a certain extent still is, a systemic problem when it comes to the Greek administration.
Thank you. Well, I think that leads in probably quite well to some of your thoughts. I'm sure you're going to cover technology, but Professor Acemoglu, give us some opening thoughts on the state of the world, the rather troubled state of the world that we have today.
Well, first of all, let me say it's a true pleasure to be here. The last time I was in Athens, that's actually when I got the call from the Nobel Prize Committee, so it's a good vibration. Good vibration. So, and I'm really glad to be here, especially with the Prime Minister, but especially also because the theme of this conference, the tightrope uncertainty, I think is just one of many words we can use to describe our current state: tumult, turbulence, trouble. I think the world is gripped by at least five big trends that each by itself would be completely discombobulating. And we have to grapple with all five of them, and they could change the face of our civilization in very serious ways. And what unites all five of them, as I'm going to explain, is that in addition to deep uncertainty, they're actually not trends that we can think about like the weather report. They are things that we're deciding. So it is our choices today that will really shape how these very potentially troubling, but potentially also quite interesting changes could create opportunities and sources of new growth and new strength. The ones that really keep me up at night are AI, what it will imply for productivity, what it will imply for inequality, what it will imply for jobs. Democracy, where we are seeing, for the first time in perhaps 60 years, that democracy is no longer the only game in town, and democratic institutions all around the world are under much greater threat than ever before. The remaking of the global order, which will have huge consequences for global cooperation, which has obviously much to help us or hinder us in dealing with other trends or other important issues that have become truly global. Demographic change, the world population will start declining soon, but more importantly, world population outside Africa is about to start declining as of now, and many countries are going to be much, much older, and that has tremendous implications socially, economically, politically. And climate change, whatever we do, we will have to do mega adaptation and hopefully mega mitigation, but it is all highly multifaceted. In all of these, the choices that we make are going to be first order. Those choices are at the level of governments. So this is a very exciting time to be a leader, but a very troubling time as well. At the level of companies, because I think companies are going to be at the forefront of many of these issues, perhaps not democracy so much, but how democracy changes will have implications for companies as well, especially, I think, I'll say a few words about what this implies for companies, but also for civil society. Civil society is critical for the democracy issue. It's critical for how the globalization will play out, but also it's the bulwark that supports good policies when it comes to AI, climate change, and demographic change. I think in each one of these cases, what is so interesting but also troubling is that they are changing some of the bedrock practices, institutions that we've become so accustomed to. In the case of AI, we don't know what the future of AI will be. I think there are many different paths. Obviously, we're going to get some productivity benefits. Obviously, we're going to get some false starts. But I think the most important line ahead is about jobs. Jobs have been central to our society in every country, in every continent, for several centuries as the pathway via which we create shared prosperity, the inclusive growth the Prime Minister mentioned. Many countries have experimented with other methods, but the only surefire way is that we create jobs, we create good jobs, we create wage growth so that the economic growth benefits actually spread around society. Well, if many more types of jobs start disappearing, that's going to be a real shocker for the whole way that we organize our society. Democracy, again, we've become so accustomed that even people who stand against democracy have to sort of dress up in garbs that look democratic. Well, that's starting changing. We're anti-liberal, anti-democratic ideas are in the ascendancy, and the core of democratic institutions are really going to be threatened in the years to come. Unless economically, from a civil society point of view, we do something different. I think part of both what we're seeing with AI, inequality, and democracy is that democracy, while it remains the best system among many imperfect systems for dealing with many of our problems, I think in the eyes of a large number of people all around the world, democracy hasn't delivered on the promises that it has made in terms of shared prosperity, in terms of high quality public goods, in terms of providing voice. So I think the problem of democracy, which itself, by the way, intersects with the issue of global, new emerging global order, I think democracies have to do better, in times of crisis, in terms of very difficult, very turbulent times, which Greece, of course, has very good experience with. It's very difficult to see how sometimes democratic governance is going to get us through, but we have no choice but really strengthen those democratic instincts and democratic pathways. Global order, I think in many of these things, 10, 15 years ago, people couldn't guess the kinds of issues that we're dealing with. If, 10 years ago, somebody said that, there would be a big rift between US and Europe, and US would be cooperating with Russia, and perhaps a US-China deal would be more likely than US-Europe. rapprochement, nobody would believe it. Even science fiction movies wouldn't be accepted with that sort of scenario. And that's the situation we're in. And that has really fundamental implications. All of the problems that I'm mentioning are global. So is pandemics. So is nuclear threat. So is world peace. And we need much better global governance. And this global turbulence is not helping with any of those. But demographic change and climate change are very important as well, because they actually highlight the business end of these issues, which is also my main point that I want to end with when in the context of AI as well. I think businesses have a lot of opportunities and responsibilities, and when it comes to AI, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to demographic change, I think the future is for businesses that think outside the box in terms of creating new services, new goods, and new ways of organizing things. A lot of the hopes about AI are a little naive because they don't take into account that any technology, but one that is about communication, about data, about information like AI, is going to require a big rearrangement of how we put companies together, how companies work, what sort of new goods, new services they offer. And when you look at history, we don't remember companies that cut costs or automated a few things. We remember companies like Ford, for example, or General Motors that completely changed market. How did they do that? They reorganized production, but more importantly, they offered things that people thought were not feasible. Or didn't even think about. And that's exactly what we're going to need in a world where climate change is going to change urban structure, is going to change the consumption patterns, is going to change the energy sector. Demographic change is going to introduce completely new demands on the healthcare system, on the education system, on the way that, again, we live our social lives. All of these, together with AI, are going to create these tremendous opportunities. And I think my guess is that actually companies that manage to grab these opportunities are going to be those that don't try to just cut jobs or automate things, but they try to use their human resources in order to understand the market, understand how they can reorganize their own corporations in light of the new informational capabilities that they have at their hand, but then offer these new services and new goods. And when they do that, they can actually create more jobs. And I think depending on how you use AI, you can even create jobs for a diverse set of skills, not just for college graduates and software engineers, but for electricians, plumbers, nurses, technicians. I think one of the great promises of AI is to provide new information to people in the service of doing new things. And if we can do that, I think that is actually a much better future for democracy as well, because it creates a pathway for shared prosperity. It creates a pathway for much better government services, much better services coming from the public-private partnerships as well. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, but we have to imagine them, and we have to really stand firm in defending key values that have served us very well. I think liberal values that emphasize individual freedom, as well as equality before the law, and democratic values that emphasize voice for everybody and care for the disadvantaged in society are among those, and we shouldn't forget that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear menu of things to consider, and also thank you for ending on a more or less constructive note that gives hope. Handing it over to you for a response to that, but also I wonder whether what you said about companies also applies to politicians, that it's a time where, not just trying the old things, but having to be creative in the face of these new challenges that Professor Acemoglu was talking about. An exciting time to be a politician as well as a challenging one.
I agree with the professor's premise that governing in a liberal democracy is becoming more and more challenging. For various reasons. Complex problems require complex solutions. Democracies by nature have checks and balances, courts, auditors, public procurement rules, institutions that sometimes delay the speed of actually implementing change. We in Greece have the benefit of having a single-party majority, which I think is a great luxury these days in Europe, so at least we don't have to think through coalition arrangements and bargaining with possible coalition partners. But of course, we're judged on our results. At the same time, there is a competition from other models of governance which at the end of the day portray themselves as being more efficient, being able to deliver public goods at a faster pace. I was thinking, as a professor was speaking, an interesting comparison which I read between China and the United States. California is one of the wealthiest states in the world, the fifth largest economy. For 30 years, they cannot build a high-speed rail connection between Los Angeles and San Francisco. At the same time, China has built 25,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. Just to put things into context regarding how difficult some of these decisions, these projects are. At the same time, if you add to the mix extreme polarization, fake news and the rise of artificial intelligence in the world of politics, I can tell you the next electoral cycle, you will struggle to distinguish what is real, what isn't, what is fake, what is generated by AI, and we're already seeing the emergence of these trends. So all these are difficult challenges, although at the end of the day, we can only be judged in terms of the ability to deliver results, the consistency between what we tell people when we get elected and what we end up delivering, and I think the honesty with which we interact with people, which I do think requires a new, I'd say maybe more unscripted style of politics compared to what we saw in the past. So as far as governing, these are challenging times. At the same time, the revolution of AI, I think, can be used in order to also make sure that the government is more efficient. There are quite a few tasks, and again, AI as a sophisticated tool for automation can help our civil servants become more productive, and we've set up an AI unit within also the Office of the Prime Minister to look at these types of projects. And of course, we have a Ministry of Digital Transformation, which we are renaming now Ministry of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Transformation, to indicate the importance we assign to this emerging technology. But just to react to what you said, I'm not going to comment on all the challenges, but I do want to comment about the one which I consider to be the most pressing and possibly the most dangerous, and that is the great displacement of white-collar jobs by artificial intelligence in the effort of companies to increase productivity and, of course, returns on capital. And again, I don't think we've thought this through to the extent that we should, nor are we aware of the speed with which some of these jobs will be displaced, the implications it will have on the job market. What does it mean, for example, to retrain? A call center, maybe, a decently paying job, it could disappear within 3 years because simply the job can be done certainly cheaper by an AI chatbot. I'm just giving you one example. And this double combination of AI and robotics, which you already see in China, has the possibility for a massive displacement also of manufacturing jobs. So for the first time, I think in the history of technological revolutions, we may be faced with a technology which will not create more jobs than it destroys. And this is something which could happen. I know there was skepticism in the past with any technological revolution. When the car emerged, people were concerned about their carts and their horses. But I have a strong belief that this time it could be different, and at least we need to prepare for this eventuality, which will also have dramatic implications for what it means to work, for how long we work, what it means for our social security systems, what it means for our healthcare systems and how expensive they become, and who's going to pay for those. For example, I asked at the recent European Council a rhetorical question, but we will be forced to provide these answers. Are robots going to pay social security contributions and taxes? Because at the end of the day, if a job is destroyed by a technological replacement for a human, these contributions are going to miss, especially in our case where we have redistributive systems where today's pensions are paid by today's contributions. So I'm just giving you some extreme examples to highlight how difficult these problems are, and how we need to prepare our labor market, our educational system, for what is going to be a massive change.
If it happens, it presumably happens quite quickly. As you said, the timescale could be quite accelerated. So how do you prepare, both at the Greek level, at the national level, but also you mentioned it at the European level? Do you see any signs of your colleagues at the European level taking this as seriously as they need to?
First of all, I know that there's a lot of skepticism, especially across the Atlantic, about, regulating this technology, and I do feel that probably the skepticism is to a certain extent not justified. We have a blueprint for ensuring that these technologies are applied in a way that they respect the social values of Europe. I think we can certainly break down some bureaucratic barriers to be more entrepreneurial and to allow for these companies to grow in Europe without being sold to the big American tech giants. But there's a real risk that all the power is going to be concentrated in the hands of 5-10 big companies that are going to create incredible value for the shareholders, which operate globally, which have massive power, greater than that of governments, and which will react to any sort of regulation, even in areas which, in my mind, are incredibly sensitive. I speak a lot about the mental health of children and teenagers and their exposure to social media and technologies. And it's very frustrating to see that, these companies still insist on making money from, our kids, who they clearly impact their mental health in a way that doesn't show, any respect for what childhood is and how we in our societies protect our children. So I would say, in terms of preparing, first of all, look at those technologies where AI can really be a game changer. Healthcare, civil protection, for example. I mean, we have wildfires now. We already use AI tools as we speak to predict what the wildfire is going to do in the field. So these are,
positive.
These are, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not someone who's inherently scared of technology. In healthcare, AI can be transformative, not just in drug delivery, but also in service, in improving the experience, within a hospital. In education, tailor-made education through sophisticated tutors is going to become a reality, and you can actually make sure that you offer kids, especially in isolated places in Greece that don't have access to the traditional form of tutoring, this type of service. So let's identify those areas where AI is clearly, beneficial, and make sure we double down on those. Let's pick our regulatory battles wisely. Which are the areas we clearly need to regulate? In my mind, I have two priorities. The first is the mental health of children and teenagers, and the second is the way AI is going to impact our democratic debate and what it means for the quality of our democracy, and possibly how we can use AI for public, consultations, for making sure that the voice of the citizens are heard, because let's be clear and honest, there is a gap of trust between citizens in all Western democracies and elites. And let's ensure that we don't have, that the distribution of wealth that is created is does not end up, benefiting very few, because that's what seems to be happening right now.
Throw that back to you. I mean, you talked about how companies can possibly be quite creative in responding to this, but here you've heard how governments also need to respond. How do you see this playing out also in the context of international competition? Because it very much feeds into the changing global order that you talked about as well, potentially.
Well, I completely agree. Government's role is central and multifaceted. First of all, as Prime Minister pointed out, government services are key, and this is one place where we can use AI to really rationalize things and offer new services in a world that's becoming more uncertain, in a world where fiscal pressures are going to make it very difficult to offer the kinds of healthcare, education, social insurance that we would like. I think AI can rationalize several aspects of it. And this is another place where we see many different paths that we can take. The major use of AI in government-related affairs, for example, in China and via technologies exported from China, is for surveillance. That's one type of AI that's going to be very attractive to many governments, but that's not the only thing we can do. But the other very important thing, of course, is government regulation. The subtext of what I was talking about is that there are many different paths of AI in the production sector as well, and they have vastly different consequences. Many of them uncertain, but vastly different consequences. Going after AI, going after artificial general intelligence, or as I see them as dreams of artificial general intelligence, is one such path. It's very much fueled by the same type of desires and forces that previously brought us very rapid automation in industrial type, and its inequality implications have been drastic. I think with AI, with white-collar jobs, and with much greater data in the hands of a few companies, the inequality implications of this sort of AGI-like path would be quite drastic as well, even if, as I expect, AGI is nowhere to be found in the next 10, 20 years or so. But just the very effort of building very large models intended to automate lots of white-collar jobs and take away tasks from people would have vast consequences. On the other hand, going after creating new tasks, new capabilities for workers, new services, new goods, that's a very different path as well. And it takes several people to tango here, not just two. It takes technology companies to create the right technologies. It takes managers and companies themselves to demand these technologies and use these technologies. And it takes the right kind of government regulation, both to diminish the harmful uses of AI, but also create incentives for the right paths of AI and the right experimental structures to be explored. For example, that's currently very hampered in the United States because the tech sector has become hugely concentrated, and a non-competitive environment does not support exploration of new directions, and it creates a natural pathway for more and more resources to be poured into just the most obvious, the least resistance path, which often is building bigger and bigger models. So I think there is a lot of responsibilities for governments. Now, the problem when we come to the global aspect, however, is that I think every government can take important steps, but there is also a sense in which we are not at the peak of empowerment right now. I mean, India, Mexico, Turkey, Greece, those countries, they have millions, billions of people's future depends on them, but they don't have a voice in the future of technology. Nobody, to a first approximation, asks, what are the concerns of Indian workers, or what are the concerns of Brazilian or Mexican workers? They don't even ask what are the concerns of American or French workers, but at least there's some pressure through the democratic system there. But AI is very much concentrated in a few countries, and they are setting the agenda. So I think global governance is going to be very important, and how to actually achieve that is a challenge, but something we have to keep on exploring, and dialogue is going to be very important. But one other point, if I could make, which is U.S.-China relations. I think, of course, U.S.-China relations are determining for the global reordering that I talked about, peace, democracy. But actually, we are shooting ourselves in the foot in the U.S.-China via the AI illusions. The more the talk is AGI, and from AGI to artificial superintelligence, whoever gets there is going to have a massive strategic advantage, you are making it very much harder for U.S.-China cooperation to emerge. And we really need, as my earlier comments indicated, I am no fan of China. I think it's had a very negative effect on certain aspects of global democracy. There's a huge amount of inequality and repression in China, but we do need US-China collaboration on many important things. And the sort of these dreams or nightmares of AGI are actually pushing us into a more and more conflictual relation. So actually that's the sense in which many of these things are interrelated, and more of this global governance voice coming from all sorts of corners, more global understanding of these issues, and more countries bringing this up, I think is important to get us out of.
Well, on the question of global governance, it seems that things are actually not in good shape at the moment. And if I could bring up a word which I don't think either of you have mentioned yet, but tariffs, and the current state of tariff negotiations, and suddenly this is front and center of the Trump administration. How is the world to respond to this pressure from America for tariffs? It's affecting the US-China relationship, it's obviously affecting the US-Europe relationship, and as you say, there may be a US-China agreement before there's a US-Europe agreement. So how does Greece position itself in this very difficult situation?
We are a medium-sized country with an open economy. We are a global leader in shipping, which of course benefits tremendously from trade, so we have every reason to be in favor of a rules-based international system that encourages free trade and that ensures that these free trade agreements are completed in a reciprocal and just manner, which was not always the case in the past, especially when you think about the way that China entered the World Trade Organization system at the beginning of the 21st century. So, just to be specific, I do hope that the contours of an agreement between Europe and the US will be completed by the set deadline of July 9th. It would be, I guess,
coming up very soon.
Yeah, it would be, a basic, the premises of what would eventually be a more detailed agreement. It would be too optimistic to hope for more zero-for-zero tariff arrangements, at least in certain critical sectors. But what I'm certain is that a full-blown trade war would be clearly bad, both for the US and for Europe. At the same time, Europe is a very big market, and also in terms of perceptions, we need to also ensure that we get a good deal. So we cannot afford to give the impression that this is a capitulation to the United States, nor I think is there a desire from the European Commission, which has the exclusive responsibility to negotiate on our behalf. But speaking of tariffs, I want to get back to what I previously alluded to. We speak a lot about the single market, but if you look at the barriers to the single market within Europe, they essentially are the equivalent of a significant, internal tariff in terms of how we do business. So we have a tremendous opportunity to look at the Letta report and the recommendations in terms of how the market, the internal market, is going to work. Certainly for a country which is primarily dependent on exports to Europe, this would, such as Greece, this would be tremendously beneficial. And at the same time, I think this is a great opportunity for Europe, regardless of what happens with the US, to negotiate new free trade agreements with other countries or other regions, which are going to be critically important in the new global economic order, India being the most important one. And I think we should really try to focus on this agreement. Having said that, the agreement with Mercosur has been in the process of being finalized for many, many years.
These things are difficult, but is there a sense in which, from what you're saying, that the pressure from the Trump administration through tariffs and other means is actually has the possibility of spurring some action in Europe that might not otherwise have had the political momentum?
Well, first of all, the fact that the US can no longer be considered a totally reliable partner for Europe has clearly resulted in us taking more ownership over our own European affairs. Of course, I think this should have happened even before, President Trump came into power. The issues that are raised in the Draghi report regarding the erosion of European competitiveness go back many years, and I think this is an opportunity to take more European ownership over our own affairs when it comes to competitiveness, when it comes to defense. There's no doubt we will spend more on defense in Europe, and we are aware of the fact that we have to do so not only to ensure that NATO continues to work within the confines of a transatlantic alliance, but because we also understand that keeping our people safe is, at the end of the day, our number one responsibility. But this also entails difficult trade-offs. We spend more on defense, maybe other countries. Greece is in a good position because our public finances allow us to spend around 3% while not cutting, other spending. But I'm not sure that all countries are in that position. And of course, the issues of competitiveness are absolutely critical. I speak a lot about energy. We cannot be competitive in Europe with the price of energy that we have. And of course, there are also tremendous disparities in the prices of energy within Europe. Again, an example of a single market which exists only in theory, but not in practice. So focusing on cheaper energy, be it investments in grids, more investments in renewable, investments in new technologies such as small nuclear reactors. All these, I think, are critical for Europe to retain or to build its strategic autonomy, but also to become a leader in certain, at least, technological sectors where it can still play an important role.
And when you look around the table at the European Council, you're now one of the people who's been sitting there for longest, I guess, amongst the group. Where do you see the dynamism coming from? We have a new German leadership. We see a Europe that has much more challenging tasks.
I think on the one hand, there is a much greater awareness that we need to move faster. I have a lot of confidence in the new German government. I think they've made a very good start. And the decision to also spend more domestically is important for Europe because the German economy is very important for Europe. The Franco-German alliance engine is still very important. But of course, one needs to be aware, coming back to a previous discussion, that as politics become more and more complex in our Western democratic societies, it's quite likely that leaders will bring their own domestic problems to Brussels and to the table of the European Council. And that makes things more complex. So on the one hand, there is a greater sense of urgency. We need to do more. We're pushing the Commission to implement a lot of the recommendations in the Draghi report. But on the other hand, when governments are under pressure, they may look at their domestic constituency and not think in terms of what is really good for all of us. And if we have to take, hard decisions, which hat do we wear? Do we wear our national hat? Do we wear a European hat? Do we try to wear both? For example, we need more scale in European companies, which means we need to reform our competition rules. I'm pretty clear about that. This will create winners and losers. Some companies may get bigger. Some companies may end up not doing as well. If you have a national champion, for example, that doesn't make it in the new landscape, are you ready to accept that this is good for Europe, but not good for your own country? These are difficult and hard choices. But coming back to the decisions that we took 5 years ago, the RRF was a big decision, 750 billion euros, joint European debt. We have to make it a success. I think we are very successful in Greece in terms of using these funds for tech projects, for healthcare projects, for infrastructure projects. And we will probably, if we want to be ambitious, need more financial tools. The current budget is not fit for purpose. We will have a very difficult negotiation regarding the next budget in 2028. Greece may have a very, very important role to play because we will have the presidency of the European Council in the second half of 2027. So this is going to be a very big challenge for the government that emerges after the next elections. Hopefully it's going to be us, but no one can sort of predict the outcome of an election. So these are difficult questions, especially when it comes to how are we going to find the money to do everything we want to do. Private capital, important. We need capital markets that are well-functioning at the European level. We need maybe more consolidation in financial services. But again, if Bank X wants to buy Bank Y in one country, how will we react if that is going to be the case? So, sometimes when we wear a European hat, we say, we want all these good things to happen, but then when decisions affect us nationally, we say, oops, maybe we want to put the brakes. So this has always been the story of Europe.
It's just a bit more urgent now.
But exactly, what I do want to point out is that it's so much more urgent now.
Okay. Professor, what about your thoughts on the gauntlet that the United States is throwing down to the world right now?
Let me thank you for bringing it up, because that's a core part of course, this global reordering. And I want to share 3 thoughts with you, because I think it's, some of this is probably obvious to some people in the audience, but it's important to reiterate them. First, we can have debates about whether tariffs for some goods are or are not justified according to economic theory, but there is no justification, no way you can ever rationalize tariffs that are bilateral, uncertain, constantly renegotiated and uncertain. They just make no economic sense whatsoever. But then, why this way of imposing tariffs? Because the diagnosis is very important. Because international relations, international economic relations are completely secondary to Trump's agenda. Trump's agenda is a domestic one, and it's very related to what I talked about, democracy's sort of trial by fire right now. It's about building what some people would call an executive presidency or imperial presidency with a huge amount of powers concentrated in the presidency in his own hands. And a lot of other things are vehicles for that. And if you think about it, what would justify or what would rationalize tariffs that give huge amount of power to a president to renegotiate them upon demand? Well, it's power. It's power against other countries, but it's power against domestic companies as well. You can destroy Apple or any other company by just putting tariffs on exactly their own supply chains. So once you have that diagnosis, you see why these tariffs are so dangerous and why we are living through a very uncertain time. But the third point is that I think the costs of the Trump presidency economically are only going to be revealed in the next few years. And one very big one, which is completely missed by Trump's own team and sometimes by others who write about it, is that, a very important part of U.S.'s economic vibrancy is that there is a tremendous amount of demand for U.S. assets, government debt, corporate debt, equity. And that comes because those are viewed as liquid, safe, and backed up by an institutional structure that is fairly stable and courts that function and so on. That's what's being damaged. It's whether, the dollar is the reserve currency or not. That's secondary, and it's not an unstable thing. But if the world starts reducing its demand for U.S.-backed assets, that's going to have tremendous effects on the U.S. economy and on the global economy, because that's the plumbing of the global economy. And it's inevitable that's going to happen with these policies, because it's weakening all of that institutional fabric that's supporting all U.S.-backed assets. And I think the implications of that are going to be very far-reaching.
We're coming to the end of our time, but I want to, as a final question for both of you, and I'll come to you first and give the Prime Minister the last word. The question of priorities. You brought up the priorities at the beginning, but in this very, very uncertain environment, and you mentioned your 5 themes, what do you think is the #1 priority for anybody in this room in thinking about this very uncertain future at the time?
Well, I think everybody has to make their own decisions, but I think from my point of view, I think first we have to keep our sanity. It's very hard to do it in these days. But second, I think it's very important to have an ethical core. Many of these changes are really very far-reaching. They're going to have huge effects on people who are not even able to speak for themselves. And I think, again, the reason why I emphasize liberal values and democracy, I think those are the cores of the things that could be the vehicle for both people within our countries and globally to actually benefit. And sort of thinking about those issues and thinking about, what our choices imply for the rest of humanity, I think those are really first-order concerns, especially during these turbulent times.
Greece is a good place to think about ethics. Prime Minister, your priorities halfway through your second term. What about your priorities for the remainder of the term?
In a very uncertain and unpredictable geopolitical environment, I'd argue that the first priority of any government is to keep the country and its citizens safe. And then, of course, halfway through our second term, my priority is to ensure that I honor the trust that people placed in us in a double election in 2023. And the question I ask myself, but I also ask my team, is the following. If in 2027 we will have delivered on our program and we will have more or less done what we committed to do, while acknowledging that governing is difficult, and that of course there will be setbacks and mistakes, will we have been a successful government in terms of at least making sure that we didn't tell people one thing and we did the exact opposite? Because the real problem today, and we've not spoken a lot about this, in democracies is this notion of trust. Trust is being eroded, across the board. It's eroded across generations. The younger people feel, and rightly so, when they listen to the professor, laying out all these threats and these problems. I mean, there's reason why one should feel not particularly optimistic. So it's again building these relationships of trust, and at the end of the day, it may sound mundane, but I have a long list of things which I want to get done, and I want to do as many of those because that's what I told people in 2023 I would do. At the end of the day, that is the notion of accountability. What does accountability mean? It means whether you are consistent and whether you can actually deliver on what you said you would do. But to conclude from where we started, it will be about the economy. It will be about real convergence. It will be about wages and disposable income. It will be about offering people ammunition to fight this increased level of prices, which was a result of the pandemic, which is a problem everywhere, but also in Greece. At the end of the day, are people going to feel that they're better off after 4 years, and will you be able to offer them a clear path about the future? Because no one is going to vote for you because of what you did, but they will vote for you if they believe that you can do more things. And the past is important only to the extent that it serves as an indication of your intentions and your capabilities.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for distilling this very complicated, uncertain world into a few home truths, and how interesting that we end up, after it all, with questions of ethics and trust, which are so basic. We will be back, of course, next year to check up on your progress, I hope, here in Greece, but also very grateful to have your broad perspective here tonight. Prime Minister, Professor, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you.